You probably think of Indiana as flat farmland stretching endlessly toward the horizon, right? Cornfields, small towns, maybe a basketball hoop in every driveway. But what if I told you that hidden beneath those rolling hills and river valleys lie some of the most enigmatic prehistoric structures in North America? Massive earthworks that predate the pyramids of Egypt, geometric enclosures so precise they rival modern engineering, and burial complexes that speak to a sophisticated civilization we're only beginning to understand? These aren't the crumbling ruins of some distant desert. These are the forgotten monuments of America's heartland, and they're far older and stranger than most people realize. For centuries, scholars have argued over who built them, why they were constructed with such astronomical precision, and what happened to the people who once gathered at these sacred sites by the thousands. The answers remain frustratingly out of reach, despite decades of excavation, carbon dating, and cutting-edge remote sensing technology. Tonight, we're diving deep into Indiana's most perplexing archaeological enigmas, places where the evidence contradicts itself, where oral traditions collide with scientific data, and where every new discovery seems to generate more questions than answers. You'll hear about mountaintop fortresses that shouldn't exist in the Midwest, ceremonial centers aligned to celestial events with impossible accuracy, and artifacts that suggest these ancient builders were connected to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. We'll explore theories ranging from the plausible to the absolutely wild, and I promise you this: by the end of this journey, you'll never look at the American Midwest the same way again. Some of these mysteries have haunted archaeologists for generations. Others have only recently come to light through advanced technology that lets us see beneath the soil without ever turning a spade. But all of them share one thing in common: they challenge everything we thought we knew about prehistoric North America. So settle in, because we're about to uncover secrets that have been buried for millennia, right beneath the feet of modern Hoosiers who drive past these sites every single day without realizing what lies hidden in the landscape around them. Let me take you to the Knobstone Ridge Enclosures, a series of massive stone and earth walls snaking across the highest peaks of southern Indiana's uplands, dating back to approximately 800 BCE. These aren't your typical Hopewell earthworks. They're something altogether different, more aggressive, more militaristic in their design. Imagine standing on a windswept ridge 300 feet above the surrounding valleys, looking down at concentric walls of limestone blocks fitted together with disturbing precision, forming a defensive perimeter that stretches for nearly 2 miles along the ridgeline. The walls themselves range from 8 to 12 feet high in some. Preserved sections, though erosion and centuries of farming have reduced much of the complex to barely visible undulations in the forest floor. What makes the Knobstone enclosures so baffling is their location and purpose. Why would a supposedly nomadic late archaic population invest the staggering labor required to haul thousands of tons of stone up steep slopes to build what appears to be a fortress? The standard narrative tells us that large-scale defensive architecture didn't appear in eastern North America until the Mississippian period, more than 1,500 years later. Yet here we have evidence of organized warfare, territorial control, and centralized authority at a time when people were supposed to be living in small, mobile bands. Excavations in the 1970s uncovered layers of ash and charcoal throughout the interior, suggesting the site was deliberately burned, not once, but at least 3 separate times, over a period of several centuries. Whoever controlled this ridge faced serious enemies. Archaeologists have recovered projectile points of a style associated with cultures from the Great Lakes region, hundreds of miles to the north, embedded in the walls themselves. Were these invaders, or evidence of far-flung alliances? The pottery fragments tell an even stranger story. Mixed among local wares, researchers found ceramics with decorative motifs identical to those produced by coastal peoples of the Carolinas, implying trade connections or cultural exchange across 1,000 miles of wilderness. But here's where it gets genuinely perplexing. Scattered throughout the site, excavators discovered human remains that don't fit the expected pattern. These weren't formal burials with grave goods and ceremony. They were haphazard deposits of disarticulated bones, many showing evidence of perimortem trauma. Cut marks on the bones suggest deliberate defleshing, and some skulls show the distinctive fracture patterns consistent with being struck by stone axes. The bones themselves present an anatomical puzzle that mainstream archaeology struggles to address. A significant percentage of the skeletal material comes from individuals who would have stood between 6'6" and 7 feet tall, with bone density and morphology suggesting extraordinary physical strength. The local Shawnee and Miami tribes, who arrived in the region much later, preserved oral traditions about a race of giants who once inhabited the high places and waged endless wars against one another until they destroyed themselves. Could these legends contain a kernel of historical truth? The conventional explanation dismisses the giant bones as measurement errors or the remains of individuals with pathological conditions like acromegaly. Yet the frequency of these unusually large individuals in the Knobstone deposits far exceeds what random chance would predict. One researcher counted skeletal remains from at least 18 individuals over 6.5 feet tall from a single burial pit, a statistical impossibility if we're talking about occasional genetic anomalies. Still, for all the evidence of conflict and the tantalizing hints of a warrior culture, we have no idea what ultimately happened to the builders of Knobstone. The enclosures were abandoned around 400 BCE, and the archaeological record simply goes silent. No migration route, no successor culture, no explanation. It's as if an entire civilization simply vanished from the ridgetops, leaving only their cyclopean walls and the bones of their dead. Now let's shift our attention to the Wabash River Astronomical Complex, a grouping of earthen mounds and timber structures near the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers, constructed during the Middle Woodland period around 200 CE. On the surface, this looks like a typical Hopewell ceremonial center, conical burial mounds arranged around a central plaza, evidence of feasting and ritual activity, exotic materials imported from across the continent. But when archaeologists began surveying the site with modern GPS equipment and aerial photography, they discovered something remarkable. The entire complex is laid out according to precise astronomical alignments that track solar and lunar cycles with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible with Stone Age technology. The main axis of the site runs exactly 23.5 degrees off true north, the precise angle of Earth's axial tilt. The four largest mounds mark the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. Secondary structures align with the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. Most remarkably, a series of wooden post holes discovered during excavation formed a massive circle that archaeologists realized was a sophisticated lunar calendar, capable of predicting eclipses years in advance. The precision required to create these alignments demands generations of careful observation, mathematical calculation, and organized effort. These weren't lucky coincidences. They were deliberate engineering feats. Picture yourself standing in the central plaza on the morning of the winter solstice, 2,000 years ago. The air is bitter cold, your breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Around you, hundreds of people from across the Midwest have gathered, their faces painted, their bodies wrapped in furs and woven cloth. Priests or astronomers, whatever they called themselves, stand atop the eastern mound, watching the horizon with intense concentration. And then, precisely where the builders planned it centuries before, the first ray of sunlight breaks through a natural notch in the distant hills and strikes a polished copper disc mounted on a wooden post at the plaza's center. The crowd erupts in celebration because once again the ancestors' knowledge has proven true. The sun has returned, the cosmic order holds, and the people are safe for another year. This is sophisticated science wrapped in spiritual ceremony, and it tells us these people understood their world with precision we're only beginning to appreciate. The trade goods recovered from the Wabash complex read like an inventory of pan-continental commerce. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, and grizzly bear teeth from the northern plains. The scale of these trade networks is staggering. We're talking about materials transported thousands of miles through territories controlled by dozens of different groups, implying either peaceful alliances or powerful merchant classes who could negotiate safe passage. Chemical analysis of the obsidian allows researchers to trace it to specific volcanic sources in what is now Yellowstone National Park, meaning someone carried those precious stones across more than 1,500 miles of wilderness. The effort required to maintain these connections suggests the Wabash complex wasn't just a local ceremonial center. It was a major hub in a continent-spanning economic and religious network. But there's a darker thread woven through this story of astronomical achievement and long-distance trade. In one of the burial mounds, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 47 individuals, all apparently killed simultaneously. Unlike the careful burials elsewhere in the complex, these bodies were dumped unceremoniously into a pit, many with their hands bound behind their backs with strips of leather. The bones show no signs of disease or famine. These people were killed deliberately, and the manner of their death suggests ritual sacrifice on a massive scale. Carbon dating places this event at approximately 230 CE during what should have been the height of the complex's power and prosperity. Some researchers argue this was evidence of a slave class or captives taken in warfare, but the presence of high-status artifacts buried with some of the victims complicates that interpretation. Among the dead were individuals wearing copper ornaments and buried with obsidian blades, markers of elite status. Were these willing participants in some apocalyptic ritual, or was this evidence of a violent power struggle within the society itself? The Wabash oral traditions collected centuries later by French explorers mention a great sickness that came from the west and a desperate sacrifice made to appease angry spirits. Could this mass grave be archaeological evidence of that legend? The people of the Wabash complex maintained their astronomical observations and trade connections for another century after this mysterious massacre, but the site was eventually abandoned around 350 CE. We still don't know what drove them away from a place they had invested so much effort to create and maintain. Deep in the hills of south-central Indiana lies the Anderson Fork Lithic Workshop, an industrial site from approximately 1500 BCE that challenges our understanding of prehistoric technology and social organization. At first glance, it's just another scatter of stone tools and flakes in a creek valley. But when archaeologists began systematic excavation in the 1990s, they realized they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary, a specialized manufacturing center where skilled craftspeople produce thousands of identical spear points using techniques that imply assembly line efficiency and quality control. The quantity of material is staggering. Preliminary surveys identified over 30 distinct quarrying and knapping stations spread across 15 acres, with waste flakes and rejected tools numbering in the millions. The sheer scale of production suggests this wasn't just a place where a few families made tools for personal use. This was an industrial operation producing standardized products for export across a vast region. Experimental archaeology has shown that the specific point style produced at Anderson Fork appears in sites across the entire Ohio River Valley and as far south as Tennessee, always in contexts suggesting they were high-value trade goods. What makes this particularly remarkable is the level of skill and standardization involved. Modern flint knappers who've examined the Anderson Fork tools report that they're virtually identical in size, shape, and flaking pattern, implying either a single master craftsperson working with apprentices or a strongly enforced quality control system. The geological analysis adds another layer of mystery. The chert used at Anderson Fork comes from a specific stratum of rock, exposed only in a few cliff faces in the immediate area. This stone has unusual properties. It's extremely fine-grained, takes an exceptionally sharp edge, and has a distinctive mottled appearance that makes it instantly recognizable. In other words, it's branded. A warrior or hunter carrying an Anderson Fork point was making a statement about quality and status, like driving a luxury vehicle today. The economic implications are profound. If this site was producing standardized trade goods on an industrial scale 4,000 years ago, it suggests a level of economic complexity that most archaeologists thought didn't exist in North America until much later. We're talking about specialized labor, surplus production, long-distance trade, and possibly even a form of currency or barter system based on these high-quality tools. But here's the truly weird part. Interspersed among the industrial debris, excavators found evidence of intensive ritual activity that seems completely at odds with mundane tool production. Ceremonial pits contain burned offerings of exotic materials, copper beads, carved bone ornaments, pouches of red ochre pigment, and the carefully articulated skeletons of birds and small mammals. One pit contained the skull of a black bear placed atop a stack of more than 300 perfect spear points, deliberately broken in half. The juxtaposition of industrial manufacture and ritual sacrifice suggests these people didn't separate the practical from the spiritual the way we do. Making a perfect spear point wasn't just good craftsmanship, it was an act of devotion, a prayer rendered in stone. Now imagine walking through this ancient workshop on a summer afternoon 3.5 millennia ago. The valley echoes with the sharp crack of stone striking stone as dozens of knappers work simultaneously, each seated at their individual stations, piles of raw chert beside them, growing mounds of waste flakes at their feet. Children run between the work areas, carrying finished points to a central location where inspectors examine each one, discarding any with flaws. The air smells of dust and sweat and wood smoke from fires where points are being heat-treated to improve their flaking properties. And somewhere nearby, a priest or shaman tends a sacred fire, chanting prayers for the success of the work, for the quality of the stone, for the skill of the craftspeople. It's a scene that collapses the boundary between factory and temple, between economic production and religious devotion. The people of Anderson Fork worked their trade for at least 5 centuries, possibly longer, making this one of the longest operating industrial sites in prehistoric North America. And then, like so many of these ancient places, it simply stops. Around 1000 BCE, the archaeological signature vanishes. No gradual decline, no sign of destruction or invasion, just an abrupt cessation of activity. The quarries went silent, the workshops were abandoned, and the trade in branded spear points dried up. We still don't know why a successful operation that had endured for half a millennium suddenly ceased to exist. Let's venture north to the Mississinewa River effigies, a series of massive earthen mounds shaped like animals and geometric forms built during the late woodland period around 600 CE. These aren't the most famous effigy mounds in the Midwest. That honor goes to the spectacular creations in Wisconsin and Iowa, but the Indiana examples are arguably the most mysterious because they break all the established patterns. Effigy mounds typically depict local animals, bears, birds, panthers, turtles, and are found in clusters on high ground overlooking rivers or lakes. The Mississinewa effigies do none of these things. First, they're located in a low-lying floodplain that would have been swampy and periodically inundated, not the kind of place you'd expect to find sacred earthworks. Second, the forms are unlike anything else in the effigy mound tradition. The largest, nearly 400 feet long, appears to represent some kind of serpentine creature with multiple heads at both ends, a form that has no parallel in known Native American iconography. Another shows what looks like a geometric star pattern, with 12 points radiating from a central mound, precise enough that some researchers initially dismissed it as a modern construction. A third depicts what can only be described as a humanoid figure, but with proportions that are distinctly wrong. The arms are too long, reaching past the knees, and the head is disproportionately large. The combined effort to construct these features would have required moving tens of thousands of cubic feet of earth, all carried in baskets one load at a time. Remote sensing surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that the effigies contain internal structures that add to their mystery. The serpent effigy, for instance, has a stone chamber near its center, carefully constructed from limestone slabs and sealed shut. Excavation revealed the chamber was empty. No burials, no artifacts, nothing to explain its purpose. One researcher described it as a vault built to contain absence, which is a poetic way of saying nobody has any idea what it was for. The star pattern effigy contains 12 smaller stone-lined pits arranged in a circle, each exactly 20 feet from a central post hole. Chemical analysis of soil from these pits showed elevated levels of phosphorus and calcium, suggesting organic materials were buried and have since decomposed. But what materials and why? The humanoid effigy is perhaps the strangest of all. Ground-penetrating radar shows it contains numerous stone structures throughout its body, arranged in patterns that some observers have suggested represent internal organs: a heart, lungs, a digestive system. The implications of this interpretation are unsettling. If these ancient builders were creating a giant anatomical representation in earth and stone, it suggests a level of medical knowledge and a ritual purpose we can barely begin to understand. Were they trying to create a symbolic body for a dead god? Were they mapping the cosmos onto human form? Or is the resemblance to internal organs just coincidental, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist? The material culture associated with the Mississinewa effigies is equally puzzling. Artifacts recovered from ritual pits near the mounds include objects that have never been found together anywhere else in the archaeological record. High-quality pottery from the Hopewell culture of Ohio sits alongside cruder vessels of a style associated with plains peoples from hundreds of miles to the west. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast share space with freshwater pearls from the Mississippi River system. Copper ornaments worked in styles typical of the Great Lakes region are mixed with carved bone pieces, showing artistic motifs from the southeast. It's as if people from across half the continent gathered at this unlikely swamp to participate in ceremonies we can no longer comprehend. One particularly intriguing artifact is a polished stone tablet about 8 inches square, inscribed with symbols that don't match any known Native American writing system. I need to be careful here. There's a long and unfortunate history of fraudulent, inscribed stones and bogus claims about pre-Columbian visitors to the Americas. This tablet has been examined by multiple experts, and while everyone agrees the inscriptions are genuinely ancient, nobody can agree on what they represent. Some see abstract designs, others claim to detect patterns reminiscent of early Mesoamerican glyphs, and a few researchers have suggested connections to Bronze Age writing systems from the Mediterranean, a claim that, if true, would revolutionize our understanding of ancient maritime capabilities. The mainstream academic community remains deeply skeptical of any Old World connection, and rightly so given the lack of corroborating evidence. But the tablet exists, it's genuine, and nobody can explain what those symbols mean, or why they were carved onto that particular stone and deposited at the base of the strange humanoid effigy. We still don't know who built the Mississinewa effigies, or what purpose they served. Travel with me now to the Blue River Causeway complex, a network of raised earthen roads constructed through wetlands, and connecting a series of small mounds dating to approximately 900 CE. The discovery of these causeways is relatively recent. They were only identified through aerial photography in the 1980s, when the right combination of drought conditions and low-angle sunlight made them visible as crop marks in agricultural fields. Ground surveys confirmed what the photos suggested: a sophisticated transportation and ritual landscape covering more than 50 square miles, with the main causeway stretching for over 6 miles in a nearly straight line, despite crossing rivers, wetlands, and varied terrain. The engineering achievement alone is remarkable. The causeways are elevated 2 to 4 feet above the surrounding landscape, carefully graded to maintain a consistent level, and constructed using multiple layers of different soils that provide stability and drainage. Modern civil engineers who've examined the structures express respect for the sophistication of the design. These aren't crude paths piled up haphazardly. They're carefully engineered roads built to last centuries. In places where the causeway crosses permanent water features, excavation has revealed foundation structures made of logs laid perpendicular to the road's direction, creating a stable base in unstable soil. The builders clearly understood the principles of foundation engineering and hydraulic management, but the real puzzle isn't how they built the causeways, it's why. The mounds connected by these elaborate roads are modest in size and show no evidence of having served as major population centers or elite residences. Excavation of several mounds revealed they contained burials, but these were ordinary people, not high-status individuals buried with exotic grave goods. So why invest the enormous labor required to connect these unremarkable sites with miles of raised roadway? The only explanation that makes sense is that the causeways themselves were the point. The journey mattered more than the destination. Perhaps these were processional ways, routes taken by pilgrims or participants in seasonal ceremonies, with the act of walking the sacred road being more important than whatever lay at the end. This interpretation gains support from the discovery of small stone markers placed at regular intervals along the main causeway, each carved with the same simple symbol, a spiral design that appears in rock art throughout eastern North America. Were these mile markers, prayer stations, or something else entirely? Equally mysterious are the dead ends. Several major causeways simply stop in the middle of nowhere. No mound, no natural feature, just the abrupt termination of a carefully constructed earthwork in the center of what would have been an impassable swamp. Archaeologists initially assumed these were unfinished projects, abandoned for unknown reasons, but careful excavation at the terminal points revealed elaborate ritual deposits, layers of carefully arranged shells, bones, broken pottery, and burnt offerings, suggesting these supposed dead ends were actually important destinations in their own right. What ritual purpose was served by building a raised road to the middle of a swamp? Some researchers have proposed these were symbolic journeys to the underworld, with the causeway representing the path between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The swampy terminal points would then represent liminal spaces, neither fully land nor fully water, where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The carbon-14 dates tell us the Blue River causeways were built rapidly, probably within a single generation, suggesting a coordinated effort directed by centralized authority. This contradicts the prevailing model of late woodland societies as decentralized and egalitarian. Someone had the power to mobilize hundreds or thousands of workers for a massive public works project that served no obvious practical purpose. And then, as with so many of these sites, the system was abandoned. By 1100 CE, the causeways were no longer maintained. The mounds stopped receiving burials, and the ritual landscape fell into disuse. Later Native American groups who occupied the region had no memory of who built the roads or why. One of the most tantalizing aspects of the Blue River Complex is its possible connection to astronomical observations. The main causeway runs almost exactly southwest to northeast, and if you stand at the southwestern terminus at sunset on the winter solstice, the sun sets directly along the causeway's axis, creating a visual effect where the road appears to stretch toward the dying light. Coincidence or intentional design? We still don't know, and we may never know, what stories these ancient people told themselves as they walked these sacred roads between earth and sky, life and death, the known world, and whatever lay beyond. Our next stop takes us to the Flat Rock River Glassworks, a site that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines of technological development in North America. Discovered only in 2003 during highway construction, the site dates to approximately 1200 CE and contains evidence of high-temperature pyrotechnology that has forced archaeologists to reconsider what was possible in prehistoric Indiana. The site consists of multiple clay-lined furnaces capable of reaching temperatures above 1500 degrees Celsius, surrounded by debris that includes slag, malformed vessels, and hundreds of small glass beads in brilliant colors: emerald green, deep cobalt blue, vibrant crimson. The beads themselves are unremarkable. Glass bead manufacturing was well established in many parts of the world by this period, and examples have been found at Mississippian sites across the southeast. What makes Flat Rock extraordinary is that the glass was manufactured on-site using local materials, not imported as finished beads. Chemical analysis proves conclusively that the silica source was local sandstone, the flux came from plant ash, and the colorants were derived from minerals available within 50 miles of the site. This represents an independent invention of glass making in a time and place where it simply shouldn't exist, according to established models of technological diffusion. The implications are staggering. Glass making is not an intuitive technology. It requires sophisticated understanding of chemistry, access to materials, and most critically, the ability to generate and maintain extremely high temperatures in a controlled environment. The furnaces at Flat Rock show evidence of forced air systems, likely using leather bellows, and careful fuel management using specific types of hardwood that burn hot and clean. Someone at this site possessed knowledge that took Mediterranean civilizations centuries to develop, and they were applying it in the forests of Indiana 800 years ago. But here's where we veer into truly strange territory. Mixed in with the manufacturing debris, archaeologists found objects that don't fit the industrial context, ritual items that suggest glassmaking wasn't just a craft, but a sacred practice. Several furnaces contained foundation deposits, human bone fragments, ceremonial pottery, and carved stone figures depicting what appear to be flames or supernatural beings. One furnace had a complete wolf skeleton carefully arranged at its base before construction, positioned as if the animal was running directly into the fire. The symbolism is unmistakable. These furnaces were seen as portals to another realm, places where ordinary materials underwent transformation through the application of supernatural heat. The act of making glass, turning sand into luminous, translucent jewels, must have seemed like magic, and it was treated accordingly. Transport yourself to this place 12 centuries ago, deep in the forest on a moonless night. The furnaces roar. Like living things, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, workers feed the fires with carefully selected wood while others pump the bellows in steady rhythm, their faces gleaming with sweat in the intense heat. The master glassmaker, a figure of immense prestige and perhaps feared supernatural power, watches the molten material in the crucible, waiting for the exact moment when the sand has transformed into liquid light. With practiced movements, he withdraws a small amount on a metal rod and begins to shape a bead, working quickly before the glass cools and hardens. Apprentices watch in reverent silence, learning secrets that will take years to master. Knowledge that cannot be written down but must be passed from master to student through careful demonstration and long practice. And elsewhere in the complex, priests or shamans maintain different fires, burning offerings and chanting prayers to ensure the success of the work and protect the workers from the dangerous forces they're manipulating. The entire scene feels less like primitive industry and more like alchemy. And perhaps for these people, there was no difference. The Flat Rock Glassworks operated for perhaps 50 years, producing thousands of beads that have been found in sites across the Midwest. And then, abruptly, production ceased. The furnaces were deliberately dismantled, the tools buried in pits, and the site abandoned. We still don't know if the knowledge died with a single master craftsman, if the resource base was exhausted, or if some religious prohibition ended the practice. For our final mystery, let's examine the Whitewater Valley Stellar Cairns, a series of stone structures in eastern Indiana that represent either the most sophisticated astronomical observatory in prehistoric North America or the product of overenthusiastic interpretation by archaeoastronomers looking for patterns that don't exist. The cairns themselves are simple enough: piles of fieldstone, ranging from 3 to 8 feet high, arranged across a valley in what at first appears to be random distribution. Local tradition held they were farmers' field clearings, piles of stone removed from agricultural land and dumped at convenient locations. That explanation held until a researcher with a background in astronomy noticed something odd about their placement. From a specific vantage point on a hill overlooking the valley, the cairns align with the rising and setting points of multiple stars and constellations over the course of a year. Not just the sun and moon, those alignments are common enough in prehistoric sites, but specific bright stars like Sirius, Arcturus, and Aldebaran, as well as the Pleiades star cluster. The probability of these alignments occurring by chance is, according to statistical analysis, essentially zero. Someone built these cairns to mark celestial events with precision that implies generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation. The archaeological dating supports a construction period around 400 BCE, during the late Archaic transition into early woodland, a time of significant cultural change across the region. The cairns contain no artifacts and weren't used for burial. They're purely functional markers in a landscape-scale astronomical instrument. The sophistication of the system becomes apparent when you realize it's three-dimensional. The cairns aren't all at the same elevation. Some are on hilltops, others in valleys. And the vertical displacement between them is as important to the system's function as their horizontal positions. An observer at the primary viewing station would see different cairns silhouetted against the horizon throughout the year, each marking the heliacal rising or setting of a specific celestial body, the first appearance of a star in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility. These events were used by agricultural societies worldwide to mark seasons and time planting and harvest. What's unusual here is the number of stars being tracked and the precision of the observations. Modern reconstructions suggest the system could predict astronomical events months or even years in advance, implying these weren't just farmers noting when to plant corn. This was serious astronomy, perhaps connected to calendrical systems and religious prophecy. One of the cairns contains a stone slab with a series of carved lines radiating from a central point, the oldest known star map in North America, if the interpretation is correct. The lines correspond to the positions of bright stars visible from this latitude, suggesting the makers of the cairns weren't just passive observers but were trying to create a permanent record of celestial geometry. But there's a darker undercurrent to this story of ancient astronomy. Several of the cairns contain human remains, and not as formal burials but as apparent additions to the structures long after their original construction. The bones show evidence of violence: fractured skulls, cut marks, bones that were deliberately broken and scattered. Were these sacrificial victims, Offerings made to ensure the accuracy of the celestial predictions? Or were they enemies, perhaps rival astronomers or priests of competing traditions, whose bodies were desecrated as the ultimate insult? Local Delaware and Miami oral traditions speak of star watchers who lived in the region in ancient times and possessed dangerous knowledge that gave them power over ordinary people. These star watchers were said to demand tribute and sacrifice in exchange for their astronomical predictions, and they were eventually overthrown and killed by their resentful neighbors. Could these scattered bones be archaeological evidence of that legend? The establishment of the stellar cairns represents a tremendous investment of intellectual resources, decades of systematic observation, the development of mathematical techniques to predict celestial positions, and the physical labor of constructing the markers. The system was used for centuries, perhaps longer, with periodic maintenance and refinement, and then it was deliberately destroyed. Several cairns show evidence of having been toppled, their stones scattered. The viewing station on the hill was disturbed, possibly during some kind of violent confrontation. After approximately 100 BCE, the archaeological record goes silent. Nobody maintained the system, nobody added new observations, and eventually, the knowledge of how to use it was lost. By the time European colonizers arrived in the region, even the Native American peoples had forgotten what the cairns represented. We still don't know what happened, whether the Star Watchers were killed in an uprising, whether a natural disaster disrupted society so severely that the astronomical knowledge was lost, or whether the system was simply abandoned for reasons we can't fathom. As we reach the end of this journey through Indiana's prehistoric mysteries, stepping back from the specific sites and strange artifacts, a larger pattern begins to emerge. These weren't isolated communities scratching out a primitive existence in the wilderness. These were sophisticated societies with advanced technologies, long-distance trade networks, complex astronomical knowledge, and social hierarchies capable of organizing massive construction projects. They built monuments that have survived millennia, created art that still moves us, and grappled with the same fundamental questions that occupy us today: how to measure and understand time, how to communicate across generations, how to find meaning in a vast and often hostile cosmos. The conventional narrative of North American prehistory emphasized small nomadic bands leading simple lives until European contact brought civilization. That story is demonstrably false. The people who built the Knobstone fortifications, who plotted the movements of stars from the Whitewater Valley, who produced standardized trade goods at Anderson Fork, and who walked the sacred causeways of the Blue River were our intellectual ancestors, every bit as curious, clever, and creative as we imagine ourselves to be. Their accomplishments demand our respect and our continued investigation, because every time we dismiss these achievements or accept simplistic explanations, we're not just doing bad archaeology, we're denying our shared human heritage. What strikes me most forcefully about these mysteries is how much we've lost. Not just the physical structures, many of which have been plowed under or developed over, but the knowledge itself, the stories, the rituals, the astronomical observations passed from generation to generation, the sacred geographies that gave meaning to the landscape. When those final star watchers at Whitewater were killed or driven away, centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished with them. When the last master glassmaker at Flat Rock died without passing on the secret techniques, a unique American technological tradition ended. These losses are irreplaceable, and they should humble us when we consider how fragile cultural transmission really is. A single generation that fails to teach the next, one catastrophic event that kills the knowledge keepers, and entire ways of understanding the world simply cease to exist. The archaeological record is full of these silences, these abrupt endings where vibrant cultures simply disappear from history. Sometimes we can identify probable causes, disease, warfare, environmental collapse, but often we're left with nothing but absence and conjecture. The builders of these monuments faced challenges we can barely imagine, succeeded in creating things that still astonish us 2,000 years later, and then vanish so completely that even their names are forgotten. Yet there's something inspiring in that fragility because it means that what survives has overcome tremendous odds. Every artifact we recover, every site we excavate, every oral tradition we record represents a small victory against the relentless erasure of time. The giant bones in the Knobstone fortifications, the astronomical precision of the Wabash complex, the industrial efficiency of Anderson Fork, the enigmatic effigies along the Mississinewa, the sacred roads of Blue River, the miraculous glass beads of Flat Rock, and the star-watching cairns of Whitewater, all of these have something to teach us if we're willing to listen. They remind us that human beings have always pushed the boundaries of what's possible, have always looked up at the stars and wondered, have always tried to build something that will outlast their brief lives. The fact that we're still discovering and debating these sites thousands of years after they were abandoned proves that those ancient builders succeeded in their goal of creating something permanent, even if the meaning has been lost along the way. Every mystery we encounter is also an invitation to dig deeper, to question our assumptions, to acknowledge how much we don't know. It's tempting to want definitive answers, to demand that archaeology provide neat explanations that tie up all the loose ends. But the truth is messier and more interesting than that. The truth is that some questions may never be answered conclusively, and that ambiguity is not a failure of method, but an accurate reflection of the complexity of human history. So where does that leave us? Standing in the present and looking back across millennia at these enigmatic ancestors? It leaves us with work to do, I think. These sites need protection. Too many have already been destroyed by development, agriculture, and simple neglect. They need study using every tool modern science can bring to bear, from satellite imaging to ancient DNA analysis. They need to be incorporated into the narratives we tell about American history, which too often begin with European colonization as if nothing of consequence happened here for the preceding 15,000 years. Most importantly, these sites need to be understood in collaboration with descendant communities, whose oral traditions and cultural knowledge can provide context that no amount of carbon dating and ceramic analysis can supply. The story of prehistoric Indiana isn't just academic curiosity, it's the story of real people, the ancestors of living Native American nations, whose heritage deserves respect and whose voices deserve to be heard in the interpretation of these sites. The giants of Knobstone, the astronomers of Wabash and Whitewater, the craftspeople of Anderson Fork and Flat Rock, the builders of Mississinewa and Blue River, they were all human beings who lived, worked, loved, fought, dreamed, and died in the same landscapes we inhabit today. Their blood runs in the veins of living people, and their achievements belong to all of us as shared human heritage. As you go about your daily life in Indiana or wherever you call home, I encourage you to look at the landscape with new eyes. That unremarkable hill might be an ancient mound. That collection of field stones could be part of an astronomical observatory. The creek where you fish might have been a sacred place where craftspeople transformed stone into tools that were traded across half a continent. These places are all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting to share their secrets with anyone patient enough to look. The past isn't really past. It's layered beneath us, woven into the present landscape, speaking to us through artifacts and earthworks and bones if we have the wisdom to listen. Every shovel of dirt turned, every geophysical survey conducted, every oral tradition recorded brings us one step closer to understanding the full richness of the human story on this continent. But there will always be mysteries we cannot solve, questions we cannot answer, spaces where the evidence trails off into silence and speculation. That's not a bug, it's a feature. The unknown is what drives us forward, what keeps us asking questions, what reminds us that for all our satellites and computers and sophisticated analytical techniques, we're still just curious primates trying to understand where we came from and what it all means. Keep digging, keep questioning, keep imagining what it was like to walk these lands when they were young and the monuments were new, and the sky watchers climbed their hills to chart the movements of stars whose light had traveled for centuries to reach their eyes. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, waiting for the moment when curiosity and circumstance align to bring them back into the light.